Hello, it's Employee a Million, and welcome back to SpongeComs. Today we're looking at Season 1, Episode 8 of SpongeBob SquarePants, Sandy's Rocket and Squeaky Boots, both of which aren't the most remarkable Season 1 episodes unless you're looking at them in terms of genre and how those genres melded into SpongeBob over time. Before we get started, my question of the week this week is, what is your favourite supporting character on the show? Besides SpongeBob, Patrick, Squidward, Mr. Krabs, Plankton, Sandy, and Gary. Those are the omissions. Think about that as you're watching, and let's begin. Sandy's Rocket was written by Uncle Sherm Cohen, Aaron Springer, and Peter Burns, and its animation director was Tom Yasumi, who, in Season 1, was responsible for some of the more elaborate episodes, like SB129 and Rock Bottom, and you can kind of see how those episodes, how he had a hand in showing that he was ambitious. Because this is a very ambitious idea to take SpongeBob in so early on, only 8 episodes in, to the moon. And it made science fiction a lot more of a possible thing in SpongeBob. Like, it's already got comedy, it's already got surrealism, it's already got some action with Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy. It's already got some slice of life with the Conch Street neighborhood stuff. But science fiction is next up on the genre chopping block, and they made it so Sandy was the easiest outlet for them to do science fiction stories because she's underwater, she's a scientist, she's not of this place. And I like that. I do enjoy having Sandy be not only more mature, but more scientifically minded than the other characters, because it allows for more stories like this that go above and beyond Out of Bikini Bottom and all that. And those are always interesting, at least. They don't really do anything with Sandy's scientist streak again until Season 4, where she's all over the place. Sometimes she's karate, sometimes she's voice of reason, sometimes she's scientist. And it reminded me of Season 1, where they were still kind of developing her, but I think Season 4 had a little bit more interesting Sandy moments, but Season 1 is just a slightly better season overall, so I don't even know what I'm going on about here. SpongeBob mentions Atlantis. That's brought up again in Neptune's Spatula, I think. That's much later in Season 1, but it shows that they were a little interested in Atlantis from the get-go, and there have been certain interpretations of Atlantis in the show that I'll get to when I get to. I think the thing that people remember the most about this episode is SpongeBob being a bit more of an idiot here than in other pre-movie episodes. He's not a full-on foolishman like he is in Season 5 and 6, but he is a bit more dim-witted than you're used to in something like Jellyfish Jam. And I think that's partially due to Patrick's influence. Their dynamic was still being worked on. Sometimes Patrick was a heifer, sometimes Patrick was a dog from Cat Dog, and other times they were two halves of a whole idiot like Cosmo and Wanda. Sorry if I'm confusing you with all these Nicktoons parallels, if you're more of a Cartoon Network person or whatever, but it is very useful in conveying exactly what SpongeBob and Patrick are as a duo, and in this episode, it's childlike idiots. Not completely unbearable, because they do have some brains. SpongeBob is trying to prevent himself and Patrick from going any further, and that allows for some pretty entertaining bits, like here when the door comes crashing down on him. He was surprisingly resilient there for a sponge. But the characterization does kind of thin out across the episode as they get more wrapped into their science fiction shenanigans. And here we see Patrick playing a video game with Game Boy Tetris sound effects, according to the wiki. I haven't played Tetris on Game Boy, but yeah, odd that they'd have it like an Atari game well into the 5th gen, like the Dreamcast was right around the corner. Shows that the SpongeBob writers weren't the most electronic gamingly minded of the old school cartoon writers. But the rest of this is pretty interesting. When I think of this episode, these are usually my favorite moments, with SpongeBob and Patrick just messing around in the rocket. And SpongeBob trying to keep a cool head, but his childlike nature doesn't really allow for that. And I think that this is my favorite joke of the episode. Patrick wanting to start the rocket, and then SpongeBob showing him exactly what button gets the rocket to go off. That's a really fun little moment. I've never understood how they do like those glowing effects in cell animation. Is it like glow in the dark paint? Is it like added in post? I don't know, but here we get to a far more ambitious moment in SpongeBob history of the first season, where SpongeBob and Patrick do fall through the shuttle and they go into outer space. And also here we see a book with 2001 on it, obviously referencing 2001: A Space Odyssey, and our first instance of one of the scratch and sniff moments, because when this episode first aired in the 90s, when Nickelodeon was all about slime and gunk and all that, literally, for this episode and a lot of other Nicktoons around September 1999, they had some scratch and sniff cards that they sold at certain restaurants, and the options for this episode, the smells that you could scratch out, were peanut butter, a hot water bottle for the Squidward scene up ahead, and French fries for the next episode. But the funny thing is, they, from what I understand, for some earrings, they didn't even remove the indicators on screen of where you have to scratch and sniff. So for some or most earrings, up to 2002, 3 years later, you still sometimes have the scratch and sniff icon appear. Now, I didn't watch Nickelodeon around that time. I was barely a babe. But it's such an interesting era. It's such a Nickelodeon thing to do. To do such an ignorant thing, but innocently ignorant, as SpongeBob and Patrick are for the rest of this episode. And I think that a lot of the criticism towards this episode about just how naive they are and how much they try to relish in their own little world, I think it could be more easily forgiven if they were science fiction nerds or horror nerds. You see, in the instance where they're like Ed from Ed, Edd n Eddy, where they are into science fiction and horror and comic books and that sort of 50s geeky stuff, them seeing the world this way can be justified, but it was hardly brought up in this episode, and it's hardly a factor of their personality across the whole show, besides Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, and there we see some foreshadowing with Patrick pumping the gun towards his face. You don't really get a lot of guns in SpongeBob anymore, not even, like, silly cartoony guns. And I can understand why. Gun violence is a lot more touchy these days. Certainly wasn't in cartoons in the 20th century. And I also enjoyed this scene, it's alright, of SpongeBob and Patrick messing around with Squidward. And this is the hot water bottle that they mistake for an egg sack. The details of this one's scratch and sniff aren't available online as far as I'm aware, but I can tell there was probably like sulfur or something. Because that's what scratch and sniff cards are like. They get really rotten when you leave them around. But I digress. This is also pretty good. Just them playing with his tentacles. Apparently, well, at least according to the picture book, which might not even be part of the SpongeBob canon. I say that as they whip out cannons. Plankton and Pearl were supposed to be captured as well around this time, around this point in the episode where they're going around abducting everyone because they think they're aliens, because they think they're on the moon. Just some context clues for if you're a bit lost and haven't seen this episode before. So, Plankton and Pearl are captured and seen and all that in a tie-in book for very young children, which was made, I think, a year or two after this. I don't know exactly how valid that is as evidence that they were originally meant to appear in this episode, but if it is quote-unquote valid evidence, then it would have been Pearl's first appearance. We get more Mrs. Puff inflating, and a small cameo here from Flats the Flounder, with SpongeBob appearing in his medicine cabinet, and also a cameo from Larry. I think when you remember this little moment with Flats, I think a lot of the emotions in the bully in season 3 become a lot more justified. It was probably unintentional, but we haven't seen Flats since 2001, thankfully or unthankfully. A more technical problem that I have with this ending is that when everyone is in baskets, they don't look distinct enough. They all just look like netted circles with angry faces on them. You see here, you can barely tell that that's Sandy. I think they could have made her a little more distinct, a little more appealing visually. That was a little bit of a improvement, giving her eyelashes. This is also a bit of a comedic highlight here with SpongeBob and Patrick turning against each other because they're just so at each other's throats now. They're just so untrustworthy of this world. And I think that this, along with SpongeBob realizing, uh-oh, I done goofed, this wasn't the moon, I think that's an okay way to end this episode. In general, I think that this episode is just okay. It's pretty average. It's not a SpongeBob grade, it's not a SpongeBob dud. It's just an episode. And if you're into science fiction, you might get something out of it 20 years on. Squeaky Boots was written by some series regulars at this point: Steve Fonte, Chris Mitchell, and the mysterious Mr. Lawrence, Doug Lawrence. None of his characters are voiced in this episode or appear, but I'm sure he did some background work. But speaking of characters, this one introduced one of Steven Hillenburg's favourite supporting characters, Pearl, Mr. Krabs' daughter. And this is a very unique character in terms of just the concept alone. Mr. Krabs, a crab, has a whale for a teenage daughter. And with that comes some jokes about how crabs are cheap, generally, and Krabs is cheap. And Pearl, the whale, is very big and a bit of a handful. And I think that's a very relatable dynamic for fathers and daughters to have to deal with. And they're not SpongeBob's target demographic, so it does sort of find a way to appeal to them, which is something that kind of fascinates me about Mr. Krabs and his relationship with Pearl, and that it wasn't specifically made for this sort of show, yet it worked. They did gradually work it out, because Steve was constantly saying, here's a Pearl idea I've got, and they do it, and it wouldn't be one of the show's most well-remembered episodes. But this episode did sort of set a precedent for what a Pearl episode was, with the start. That did sort of seem like a whale of a birthday moment. But the rest of this episode is barely about Pearl. It's about Mr. Krabs being stuck with these boots and feeling guilty over all the different ways he tries to get rid of them. First idea being to give them to SpongeBob, which he calls earlier in this scene Sponge Boy Me Bob, a variation of his occasional phrase SpongeBob Me Boy. And I think this was in reference to Sponge Boy, which was a mop product around this time. Must have been way, way earlier, but that was what Hillenburg wanted to call SpongeBob initially, but it was copyrighted, so they settled on SpongeBob because they still wanted Sponge, and Bob because he looks like a Bob. Let's just go with it. And this is a pretty decent joke here. SpongeBob just sort of throwing his life away just for the boots because Mr. Krabs just did a good job of selling them to him. Does sort of show that this was, I think, the third episode to be animated after Help Wanted and He at the Tree Dome. This was SB 102, I think was its production code. So, counting Help Wanted, it's the third episode to be storyboarded and animated. I think it might be a different story about voice acting and editing. But still, this was a very early episode, and darn doesn't feel like it, because maybe they didn't have the sound design all there yet, because a common criticism you see towards this episode and why it isn't as revered as most other pre-movie episodes is because of the squeaking of the boots. Naturally, the boots have to be squeaky, but there's only like 3 sound effects that they use, and they get very loud and obnoxious most of the time, usually without much comedic exaggeration, like characters reacting to it and being annoyed or horrified by it. And that does sort of hurt the episode's reputation if you have sensitive hearing. This is also another pretty good joke. Mr. Krabs thinking about counting money in his sleep. And in general, I don't really know what this scene is about. Like, what really is the point of it? Is it to show that Mr. Krabs is feeling guilty over giving away the boots to someone who is overusing them? If so, then what does closing a window tell us about that? I mean, the scene is fairly entertaining when you separate it from the rest of the episode and separate those squeaking sounds. The squeaking sounds aren't as terrible as what the show would do later on, but it still marks some points off this episode, unfortunately. However, the scene, as pointless as it is, has a couple alright gags, like Mr. Krabs roaring, growling at the window to shut it, as if the window has a mind of its own. That's a good way to end the routine. And we've also got this. Mr. Krabs getting tied up in his hammock. I don't know why he sleeps in a hammock. Is that a general thing that was on pirate ships? I don't know. But yeah, Mr. Krabs is getting more tired of SpongeBob's squeaking boots, and Squidward's going on vacation. He's the first of 3 characters to go on vacation in this episode. I don't know if it was just they only had a word cap for their script, or if it was supposed to be a running gag, but it also wasn't really implemented to be too obvious. But SpongeBob is really going all out and showing exactly what he can do with the boots. Isn't really affecting customer service, though. As you'll see, everyone's still enjoying their patties. I'm sure if this episode were made in season 4, 5, or later, that was especially a season 12 episode, they'd be reacting to it, they'd be wanting to leave, but instead they're kind of impressed by it, even though it's more than worn out its welcome for the audience. Like, I know some people who just want to turn the episode off at this point. I still think it's a decent episode. It still has some merit to it, especially with this scene of SpongeBob showing exactly all the types of shapes he can make with the boots, exactly all the things he can do with them. I think that it's a good showcase of who he is as a general clothes person. Not exactly a boots person, but as someone who sees everything for what it's worth. And with these boots that Mr. Krabs got for $2, he's going to take advantage of how they sound. And Mr. Krabs starts to pay the consequence of that. And here we see a bit more of Gary, with him being revealed to have at least auditory canals. And the next few minutes of this episode is essentially a parody of the Telltale Heart. I think this was a decent angle to take the episode in, because this is an annoying thing for Mr. Krabs, and why not bury it and feel guilty over the burial? And it didn't just take the themes like a Tortoise and the Hare fable. It took basically a lot of the lines and recontextualized them, but it is something that everyone knows. It's something that everyone can identify when it... But I think that this is my favorite joke of the episode, coming right up here. Mr. Krabs trying to make SpongeBob feel better for losing the boots by giving him some gnarly oven mitts, and SpongeBob puts them on his feet as if those are the replacements for the boots. I really like that joke. It's worth watching the episode for, when you still get episodes that are that good. So jokes that are that good. That's gotta hurt. And here is the most famous portion of the episode, the Telltale Heart scene, with a lot more squeaking than you're used to at this point in the episode, because that had sort of subsided. Don't know if it's Mr. Krabs' imagination going wild or if it's the squeaking of the boots under the floorboards that he's buried them under. But yeah, this does sort of set a precedent for how horror should be treated in the show, in this case comedically. And I think that this little sequence of Mr. Krabs losing his mind, it was a bit too ambitious to be done with the third episode, because you can see all the repeating animation, you can see all of the shots that they are using, you can kind of see exactly what they're doing, and that sort of takes me out of the experience when I have all these episodes in high definition, and very few of them do look this outdated, this disillusioning. But to be fair, Mr. Krabs' faces are priceless, especially his Dr. Boots face. I really do like that one. And this is a bit of a non-traditional ending to the Telltale Heart fable, where Mr. Krabs takes the boots, puts them in French fry oil, which is one of the scratch and sniff things, remember. They shrink, and he eats them. I'm sure in some versions of the Telltale Heart, the culprit eats the heart. And this is what it's playing up. But I've got to say, this does sort of set up how horror should be used in the show. Mostly for humor, mostly for suspense. A bit of half and half. This episode's got nothing on something like Fear of a Krabby Patty, which I've recently reviewed. I'll put a little eye icon up there to show you what I'm talking about. And here we have the second and third vacations being taken in this episode, Mr. Krabs and Pearl. I think that this is a nice, sweet way to bring back Pearl, a nice, sweet little conversation they have. Mr. Krabs still isn't over the boots for some reason, but he has got his daughter happy. He is having a vacation, apparently leaving SpongeBob to man the Krusty Krab by himself with his gnarly oven mitts. This is a nice shot. I do like it. And that's Sandy's Rocket and Squeaky Boots. They're not the best episodes in the world, but they are genre episodes, some of the first genre episodes of the show, and I think they're important for SpongeBob, even though they're lackluster in some areas. But enough about those. My question of the week for you this week is, who is your favourite supporting character on the show, besides SpongeBob, Patrick, Squidward, Sandy, Mr. Krabs, Plankton, and Gary? Basically out of Larry, Mrs. Puff, Pearl, Frying Dutchman, Fred now, Bubble Bass now, those sorts of characters that rarely get episodes centered on them, but are still entertaining, they're still memorable. Who of those are your favourites? Goodbye for now.